The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm privileged to rise today in debate on C-6, and this is Canada's House of Commons, so I'm going to do something to start off my remarks today that I haven't done in the House of Commons, but is very special in this place. I'm going to take the oath of citizenship. I swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors, and that I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen. You know, most MPs in this House, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure many of our new members of all sides, have taken part in citizenship ceremonies. And I think my colleagues would agree it's one of the most special occasions because you see people who've come to this country for remarkable opportunity. You see them with family and friends, and they take that oath or they affirm that oath, and they become an official part of the family. By that point, Mr. Speaker, they've already become a vibrant part of their community. And I attend ceremonies outdoor, inside, on Canada Day, and I write every new citizen in my riding to congratulate them, to welcome them, to thank them, and then to urge them to become an active, if they aren't already, member of the community and really engage in what that citizenship provides. And so we have to keep that in mind. In fact, I've been to homes where that letter that I've written them as a new citizen is displayed on their walls because they value that citizenship very close to their heart, Mr. Speaker. So this is an important debate that has been manipulated at times. It certainly causes passions. So I'm actually going to have a very precise discussion of the subjects in C-6 and hope that we can move some of the members from the government off their stand, which is actually not a principled stand in C-6, Mr. Speaker. And I'll explore why it is not principled with respect to revocation. But I should say C-6 is not just elimination of the narrow grounds of revocation that were extended to crimes against the state by the previous government, but the bill also intends to repeal intentions to reside provisions. Some have suggested this would impact mobility rights under the Charter. As a lawyer, I don't think that's the case at all, Mr. Speaker. I think the very basic expectation that all members of this House would have when they see people take that special oath I did at the beginning of my remarks is that they're joining the family with the intent to be part of it.
Exactly.
Why would we remove that provision, Mr. Speaker? It makes no sense. We expect people to maintain their ties with whatever country they came from, use the tremendous wealth and opportunity we have as Canadians to go around the world and explore, and intent to reside has no conflict with any of that, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, we love the fact, and I have this in my own riding in the wider GTA, where people will then become ambassadors, advocates, or fundraisers for the countries they came from when they joined the Canadian family, Mr. Speaker. And that in no way was hindered by suggesting that new citizens should intend to live in the country they're joining, Mr. Speaker, as a full citizen. So that one clearly makes no sense, Mr. Speaker, and has not been well articulated by the government either in their election or in debate so far. It also reduces the number of days that someone would be physically present, Mr. Speaker. This could be debated, but is not as controversial. Certainly the 183-day commitment is a tax-driven number, Mr. Speaker, but it's changing from the old standard of, that 183 days per year and 4 years of 6, now changing to 3 of 5. Less consternation with that principle, but that's in C-6 as well, and I haven't really heard a very clear reason for a change there, Mr. Speaker, but it's more minor, and so it's not going to be the subject of most of my remarks. And finally, the change to language requirements with the expectation that our official languages, English and French, that there's some competency for new citizens. They've changed the target groups from 14 to 64 to 18 to 54. I have some concerns with that as well, Mr. Speaker, particularly in an environment where we see the workplace, we see people working longer. and we see the important role immigration and our new citizens have in our economy, filling gaps in our economy, building businesses, becoming job creators. You know, a few years ago, nominated a friend of mine to be top Canadian Immigrant of the Year, and I think there might be a couple of members of this House that belong in that special awards ceremony given each year, because my friend, Ihor Kozak, within a decade of immigrating from Ukraine, he was serving in the Canadian Armed Forces. And I was amazed by not only embracing the citizenship and opportunity that Canada represented, but coming from an area of the world still having problems with Russia, Mr. Speaker, he wanted to not just be part of Canada, but to serve Canada. I'm amazed by immigrants in my riding, new citizens who have built businesses and are employing and adding to the economy, taking leadership roles on service clubs, in their church communities. I'm constantly amazed by that, Mr. Speaker, and we should target that, and we should make no bones that we want people to come, we want them to participate fully in our economy, in our communities, in faith groups, in civic organizations, and run for Parliament, Mr. Speaker. And many have, and we should encourage that and shouldn't shift it with the expectation that we're changing that. But most of my remarks, Mr. Speaker, will be preserved for that first element I talked about and my concern with C-6. And my concern that the Liberal government have suggested C-6 as a principled stand when it comes to revocation. Or one Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, unity of citizenship, I heard the member from Fredericton say. That is not true, Mr. Speaker. If this government and the minister who made this introduction of C-6 wanted to be principled, Mr. Speaker, he would end revocation. Revocation is not ended in C-6, Mr. Speaker. Some of the grounds for revocation are removed, but revocation of citizenship for a naturalized Canadian remains, Mr. Speaker. And I'm going to show how actually the moral blameworthiness of the narrow crimes against the states provision we added in the previous government perhaps should attract revocation more than fraud or misrepresentation, Mr. Speaker, or at least equally in terms of the moral blameworthy standard, which is the underpinning of criminal law, Mr. Speaker. And I do have to say I'm very proud of the last Conservative government's record when it came to immigration and new Canadians. We had 1.6 million new citizens over the course of that government, Mr. Speaker. 2014 was a record year with 263,000 plus new citizens joining the family. Reciting that oath, I started my remarks on. Very, very important. And we did not reduce immigration despite a global recession, Mr. Speaker, because we know how critical our new citizens are to our economy, to building opportunity for others. And the Conservative government's average of about 180,000 or so new citizens per year is much higher than the 164,000 or so under the previous Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. So there's a lot of rhetoric with respect to C-6, but I haven't heard much statistics support or even moral clarity for the direction the government's taking. One thing that all members of this House should recognize, Mr. Speaker, is that equality is not sameness. Not everyone is the same. In fact, we embrace diversity, and diversity is part of the equality all Canadians enjoy. But it's important to let the government know there are citizens that have rights and responsibilities as Canadians, and there are citizens that have rights and responsibilities and obligations as other citizens as well, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Canada has almost 1 million dual citizens. We have about 200,000 people born here that acquire citizenship in another country through a family member, Mr. Speaker, and about 750,000 dual citizens who are naturalized Canadians and retain their citizenship from their mother country or where they came to Canada from, Mr. Speaker. And you know, if the Prime Minister, and I've heard him say a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, well, if he wanted to do that, you could eliminate dual citizenship, Mr. Speaker. Because duals actually, in some cases, have military service obligations, like in Greece. They may have tax obligations. And so there's rights and responsibilities as a Canadian, and some Canadians have additional rights and responsibilities, and that has to be debated. I embrace dual citizenship, Mr. Speaker, but I actually dive into the issues. I don't use just a slogan. Right. Let's recognize that for what it is. And a lot of Canadians cherish the ability to have that dual structure. But let's not suggest that that's the norm, Mr. Speaker. In fact, 52 countries do not allow dual citizenship. And this should be part of this debate if we're going to have an informed debate in this House of Commons on the issue of citizenship. And many of those countries, Mr. Speaker, are liberal democracies and allies and friends. You know, Germany, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands do not permit dual citizenship. India, Japan, South Korea, China don't permit dual citizenship. So when new members of our family become citizens in Canada, for those countries, any of those 52 I talked about, they lose their citizenship automatically. And I don't suggest we go there, but let's have a debate. If we're going to recognize that some Canadians have additional rights and responsibilities attached to their citizenship, let's have that debate, Mr. Speaker. And let's not suggest that what was done by the previous government was somehow diminishing Canadian citizenship, Mr. Speaker. I would say it was recognizing how important it is, and the duty of fidelity and loyalty and the shared commitment of the country and the state and the new member. So revocation, Mr. Speaker, is still permitted by this government for fraud or misrepresentation, but not for the narrow grounds of crimes against the state. There's been 56 revocations since 1977, and there's some that are hard to nail down in recent numbers, so it's likely harder than that. Only one of those is Mr. Amara, one of the Toronto 18 terrorists that was convicted for plotting terror attacks. The others are primary Nazi war criminals, but in 2011, Branko Rogan his citizenship was revoked, and that was supported by the federal court, and Justice McTavish recognized that the inhumane acts in the Bosnian conflict and the fraud when coming to Canada led to revocation, Mr. Speaker. What was the abusive act? He abused Muslim prisoners in Baleka in Bosnia. Evidence was provided and citizenship was revoked. Why was it revoked? For the fraud or misrepresentation in coming here, and the court recognized inhumane acts, which is why he was committing fraud. So we made a moral determination based on his previous behavior. But if somebody has that same reprehensible, inhumane acts in this country, we don't determine that morally blameworthy enough, Mr. Speaker, under C-6. So if you commit fraud after being part of a genocide elsewhere, you'll be revoked. But if you promote or create that here through an act of terror or treason, Mr. Speaker, that is not somehow considered morally blameworthy enough. And that's an absurd position at law, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to you. And I haven't heard my colleagues in the government articulate a rationale why those three narrow grounds, and we're talking charges under the Criminal Code, the National Defense Act, and our Official Secrets Act, or Security of Information Act is what it's called now. So inhumane acts abroad could lead to revocation, but such terrible acts in Canada will not. I think a lot of the new members of our family making that oath, which I remind people say, shall faithfully observe the laws of Canada and my duties as a citizen. I think many of the people making that oath, Mr. Speaker, would suggest to commit crimes against the state they're now joining is morally blameworthy enough to say you have not lived up to your obligation. And this is not window dressing, Mr. Speaker. This is an oath administered in front of a judge, and that is to be a true oath. And if there's malice in someone's heart while that oath is made or fraud is made, that oath should be nullified in my mind, Mr. Speaker. So the last government extended revocation on the very narrow grounds to treason, espionage, and terrorism, crimes against the state. We've heard the slippery slope, and people were actually misleading Canadians during the election, suggesting that if they committed some criminal act. These are very narrow provisions, and I'll show you how rare they are, Mr. Speaker, because since Confederation, there's been 8 cases of treason. 8. 6 in World War I, Louis Riel, which of course was a tragedy in the early years of our country. So that's the narrow ground we're talking, Mr. Speaker. Espionage is equally as small and hard to get numbers, but it's literally in the single digits. And terrorism, since actually the last Liberal government introduced the act following 9/11, Mr. Speaker, there's been 22 convictions. 22. And of that, with the amendments made by the Conservative government, there's been 1 revocation, Mr. Speaker. So the ridiculousness of the slippery slope and the fear created by the government with respect to this issue has been shameful. Because we are talking more narrow grounds. There's been more people commit fraud for heinous acts abroad than terror or treason here, Mr. Speaker. I think that has to be part of this debate. I want to start hearing the same sort of rationale and approach, because this isn't actually new to Canada, Mr. Speaker. In fact, between 1947 and 1977, revocation under our Citizenship Act and its various forms have come and gone. Engaging with the enemy or serving in an enemy army was grounds for revocation in the past. Treason was grounds for many years and then was eliminated in '67 in a time where, treason in World War II and World War I seemed far-off notions. Pre-terrorism, Mr. Speaker, and the global rise of terrorism, Mr. Speaker. So Liberal governments of the past have revoked citizenship for fraud, for a variety of potential grounds, and that is the right of the state, Mr. Speaker, because citizenship, some scholars have described as a right to have rights. Now, we extend a whole range of rights before citizenship, which is great and a part of our country and our charter, but we have to recognize that with citizenship comes rights and responsibilities, Mr. Speaker. Revocation is not a criminal sanction, Mr. Speaker. It's been described by scholars as preservation of the conditions of membership. And when you use that description, preservation of conditions of membership, that sounds a lot like fraud or misrepresentation. If you lie about your name and what your past might entail, that's equally as bad as lying about your intention to faithfully observe the laws of Canada, Mr. Speaker, is it not? I've not heard an argument here from the government, and when you're talking a handful of cases since Confederation, Mr. Speaker, that might be extended by these narrow grounds. I'm expecting more from this government. And I think our new citizens are expecting more. And if we think of the case of Mr. Rogan, the modern war criminal who committed atrocious crimes against the Muslim population in Bosnia, it was right that we did not allow him to use fraud and gain citizenship for his inhumane acts. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, I think Canadians would expect that if someone came here with malice in their heart, made that oath, and at the same time or shortly after were plotting crimes against that new state, I would say they're not faithful to that oath, Mr. Speaker, and the high quality of citizenship we have. We've also in the past had constructive repudiation of citizenship, and that's something the Liberal government has engaged in the past as well, Mr. Speaker, where a known terror suspect abroad who's a dual is just not brought home and will languish in a foreign jail where he was caught. There's been a handful of these cases, constructive repudiation, Mr. Speaker, which I think amounts to the same thing. So what I'd like to hear from this government is more than just electioneering. This is the citizenship of our country, Mr. Speaker, and a crime against the state and the narrow grounds that we extended revocation to is a crime against what we all pledge and what we all embody as Canadians with the freedom and remarkable opportunity we have. So if the government wanted to be principled, they would have eliminated revocation. But as I said, Mr. Speaker, if revocation of citizenship is still there for fraud, for terrible acts conducted elsewhere, why would terrible acts conducted here in violation of that citizenship oath I started my remarks with, Mr. Speaker, not be equally as morally blameworthy and subject to revocation? So I'm hoping in the rest of the debate we hear this so that we can preserve how important special Canadian citizenship truly is. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.